Hello and welcome to Science Fiction University.
We're your fan and writer hosts. I'm Blue Gal.
And I'm Drift Glass. And you can visit Science Fiction University at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com, where you can also contribute to this podcast. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution to Science Fiction University, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791. And make those checks out to the Professional Left Podcast and not Science Fiction University, because the bank doesn't know who the hell that is. Warning, this episode contains spoilers for the movie Quintet, which is an inside joke that you'll get in about 20 minutes. And we're going to start off this episode with a quote from Donald Trump's second favorite Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, that you all probably already know. And here's the quote. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. And today we're going to argue against putting away certain childish things.
So-called childish things. It's also our episode of Science Fiction University before Valentine's Day.
Yes.
So this is kind of a theme of love. And how we came to love science fiction.
Yes, indeed.
In our last episode, we talked about Frederick Pohl and his story, The Day the Icicle Works Closed, which is a fairly sophisticated example of economic science fiction. In this story, corporations, corrupt politicians, and the media are the villains. And the victims are working class people who they manipulate and exploit, and how that conflict comes to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that you would hand to a third or fourth grader.
No,
or
absolutely not.
Read to your child at bedtime. It's not a children's story.
No.
Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about the process of falling in love with literature. In this case, science fiction, but of course you can fall in love with any kind of art, music, painting, poetry, ballet, whatever. But this is Science Fiction University. And so we're going to talk about falling in love with science fiction and how, as young people, we did fall in love with science fiction.
We did. We surely did. Everyone arrives on a different road, but we all arrive in the same place.
Yeah.
Now, I have been gradually decluttering the basement, which is full of things, old furniture and boxes of papers and books and stuff that didn't get damaged in the Great Flood of 10 years ago. And for the last couple of weeks, I've been sorting out old papers and shredding about 80-90% of them, which aren't of any use to anyone anymore. This is tax stuff and bank statements and student loan documents. Yes, I had student loans, and yes, I paid them off. That does not mean that we should not forgive student loans, because I'm not an asshole. And how much I paid every month to rent garage space for a car when I was living in a crappy apartment on Kenmore Avenue in Chicago. $95 a month to rent one space.
A parking space
in a different building altogether that was within walking distance of the building where I was living, which was in a crappy neighborhood in a crappy building, and that was about standard. So I also dug up a stash of my stories and poems that I'd written back during the 1990s, during the Clinton years, believe it or not. And among those treasures, I found one of Phyllis Eisenstein's great SF novels lists. Now, Phyllis sadly has since passed away, but she was a professional writer, and her husband, Alex, collected original SF art from the 1950s and 60s, which is very cool. For insurance purposes, believe it or not, they brought me over to their little house near where I live to photograph about 30 pieces of his very best stuff that he was going to display at the World Science Fiction Convention in Chicago in the year 2000, which was extremely cool, and I enjoyed it very much. Now, the list I have from Phyllis is actually more great science fiction novels. I cannot find her original page one list of canonical science fiction works that she had identified as the ones you absolutely need to read if you want to become an SF snob like me. But I'm still looking. I know it included some Heinlein and Asimov stuff, and Frank Herbert's Dune, and Ursula Le Guin's Left-Handed Darkness, and so forth. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I'm sure, was on it. There were maybe 40 titles. She passed it around and asked for a show of hands, first day of class, of who had read them as she ran down the list. Most of the students were in their 20s, and they'd read one or two or maybe three of them or seen the movie. I had read most of them. So I could tell that she initially thought, oh, great, I've got this hassle in my class. But we got along fine, and we ended up becoming very good friends. I won a couple of short story awards and edited a couple of anthologies for her. And you know what? While decluttering the basement, I also uncovered my rejection letter file.
Oh, no.
Yes, I kept all the rejection letters. Some of them were very useful, some of them were not. It is a very thick file because, you know what? Writing professionally is bloody hard and pays next to nothing. Most working writers have a spouse that works full time and pays the bills, or tenured professorship at college, or some other source of income that frees them up to write. In fact, in the end, Phyllis stopped teaching science fiction at Columbia College and took the job editing ad copy at Leo Burnett because that job had enough money to pay the bills. She was a very good editor, and it had healthcare benefits. So just for fun, I'm going to run down the more great science fiction novel list selected by Phyllis Eisenstein. These are almost all from the post-1960. And this is from the first Clinton term. So, it goes back 30 years. It's been a while. So I'm just going to read author and title. Piers Anthony Cawthon, Isaac Asimov, The Gods Themselves, great book. Algis Budrys, Michael Maas, Hal Clement, Needle. David Gerrold, he's the guy who wrote Trouble with Tribbles. The title of the book is The Man Who Folded Himself. Avram Davidson, who wrote a lot of Yiddish science fiction, which is a very, very specific subgenre of science fiction. The Phoenix and the Mirror. Samuel Delaney, Nova. I stole my Driftglass name from Sam Delaney's stories. Philip K. Dick, who you might know. Do Android Dream of Electric Sheep, and Eye in the Sky. Philip Jose Farmer, The River World series, which is awesome. Joe Haldeman, The Forever War. Harry Harrison, Bill the Galactic Hero and Make Room, Make Room. Robert Heinlein, Job, A Comedy of Justice, and Orphans in the Sky. Fritz Leiber, Gather Darkness. Walter M. Miller, A Canticle for Leibowitz, which should be on the must-read list because it's straight canonical science fiction. It's wonderful. George R.R. Martin. Is George R.R. Martin on this list for Game of Thrones? No, he is not, because that's not science fiction. That's not science fiction. He is on the list for The Dying of the Light because he's a prolific and wonderful writer. Ward Moore for Bring the Jubilee, which is awesome. A lesser-known alternate history, the Union loses the Civil War story, which I have a copy of, which people at my workplace bought me as a present. Delighted when they found out I love this stuff. Larry Niven, The Ringworld stuff. Niven and Pornell, Lucifer's Hammer and the Mote in God's Eye. Fred Pohl. She likes Fred Pohl, and I do too. The Coming of the Quantum Cats, Gateway, Man Plus, and Narabedla Limited. Robert Silverberg, The Book of Skulls, and Dying Inside. Wilson Tucker, The Year of the Quiet Sun. Jack Vance, Ephiro, and the Planet of Adventure series. James White, The Watch Below. Gene Wolfe, The Book of the New Sun. There's a whole bunch of books under the Book of the New Sun. And finally, Roger Zelazny, The Dream Master and the Immortal. Thus ends the list. And you know what? If you want to become a science fiction snob, go out and get some of those books. They're all good, and they all come with Phyllis Eisenstein's seal of approval. So that's all you need to know.
Yeah, and I want to pat you on the back, Driftglass, for not only being a huge science fiction fan,
nerd,
but really grinding away at writing it and doing rather well. You have won some short story prizes,
I did.
You know, you're a talented writer. And it is true, when writing can become a grind and you're not making a living at it, one's love of the genre can start to fade.
Yes, it does. It really does.
But today we're going to talk about how and why we fell in love with science fiction and why we still love it. And my story is much shorter than yours because I was not a reader of science fiction as a young person. Mm-hmm. I fell in love with Mr. Spock, like lots of people. I caught up with Star Trek as it went into reruns, when it went into syndication in the 70s, and fell in love with Mr. Spock and how, everything, the depth of his character, him being different from everybody else. I identified with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
It just connected. I just connected with that character. Mm-hmm. And then I also love Doctor Who. My Doctor Who is Tom Baker.
Mine too. Yeah.
Yeah, yours is Tom Baker.
Mm-hmm.
Middle child has a different Doctor Who than the two of
Mm-hmm.
us, but
Mm-hmm. Well, we all have a Doctor Who, don't
we
we?
all have a Doctor Who.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's where I came into it. And after that, I did go to a Star Trek convention. You and I have been to other conventions where science fiction takes prominence
Uh-huh.
in disconnected or connected ways. So, yeah, tell me about how you got into science fiction.
Well, let me ask you before I do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I read a lot of like Encyclopedia Brown when I was a kid,
Yeah,
which was
I wasn't that much of a reader. My obsessive interest in 1976 to 1980 was politics.
well, what was
And
it?
I
I
was
mean,
reading the newspaper every day and clipping articles about Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy and
well,
that
I'm
stuff.
wondering like when I was like 8 or 9,
Mm-hmm.
or I was reading Encyclopedia Brown,
Hmm.
and other things like that. Did you have any fiction that you enjoyed when you were a little kid?
I don't remember that. I don't
Mm-hmm.
remember. I do remember my parents buying me the Phantom Tollbooth.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I don't remember reading it.
Hmm.
Maybe I did.
Yeah.
I did. Now that you mention it, I did when there was a trip that I took to my grandmother's house and I took The Hobbit with me, which is not science fiction,
No, but
but
that's Tolkien, baby.
it's Tolkien.
That's
So I
yeah.
read The Hobbit. I did read The Hobbit
Uh-huh.
when I was in maybe eighth grade, ninth
Okay.
grade.
Yeah. Because my mom, being a teacher, she would read to her class, and so she'd read to us kids, and she read Winnie the Pooh to us, so we had a lot
Mm-hmm.
of Winnie the Pooh going around the house. There's like I remember Mike Mulligan and his magic steam shovel. I seem to remember
Mm-hmm.
that is that there's a silver spoon buried in the rubble or something. But it was stuff like that, and so we had books all over the house all the time. Your parents were artists, so I imagine you
Yeah,
had visual
we
art.
had books all over the house. We had Lyle Crocodile and
Mm-hmm.
Babar and
Yeah.
you know things like that. But art was we had paints.
Exactly. You were the visual
We had a lot
artist.
of paints and stuff.
And when I used to go to people's houses, when you go in someone's house and there's no books on the shelf,
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
really feel sad for those people. I really
Mm-hmm.
feel sorry
Mm-hmm.
for them. They
Yeah.
and the flip side is like, did you actually read all those books? Yeah, I
Yes.
really read all those books. That whole library of books I had in Chicago, I read all those books. But I started off, my first science fiction hero, I must admit, was not Mr. Spock. It was Will Robinson.
Oh.
Lost in Space. This is while we were living in the Philippines in Magallanes Village, which just got swallowed up, I think, by Manila, Greater Manila. And of course, I wanted to be Batman. Who didn't want to be Batman? Batman was on television. I dressed up as Batman for Halloween. There's a picture of me in my Batman outfit that I put up on my blog every now and then. But Batman was a wealthy millionaire and a grown-up, whereas Will Robinson seemed very achievable,
Yeah, he's a
despite the fact
kid.
he was a kid. He's a kid in space with a robot. I mean, what's cooler than that? Now, after we moved back to the United States, I had an absolutely horrible third grade. And I don't mean like a really bad, unpleasant third grade. I mean horrible. My teacher actively hated me
Mm.
and would like let kids beat up on me. She was she was awful. And no one could figure out why she decided I was going to be that kid that year. But I was bullied. We were an outsider family. We weren't from there. We weren't part of the community. I was a weirdo interested in science and reading and stuff. So I was like multiply outsidered. And so I started strongly to identify with Mr. Spock as well.
Mm-hmm.
I love Mr. Spock because Mr. Spock was logical. He was imperturbable. You could throw anything you want at Spock. He'd never lose his temper and he'd always come through. And he was always there at the end. He was physically very strong and he was smarter than everybody else. And it was like all the things I wished I were paid off in the end by becoming Mr. Spock. And somewhere around here, this house that we now live in, there's a story that I wrote when I was 8 or 9 that my mom saved, and it was about time travel. So I'm writing science fiction when I'm 9 years old. So good for me.
Yeah.
Now, my 5th grade teacher either recommended Ray Bradbury's October Country to me directly, or I found it after reading whatever Bradbury book she gave me, maybe The Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man, or something. But I remember getting introduced to Ray Bradbury very early. I forget who said this, but It's not true anymore, but Ray Bradbury is the gateway drug for science fiction.
Yep.
He's the one you give to your friends to say, see, it's not painful. It doesn't hurt. It's fun. It's interesting. He's poetic. He's a good writer. And you could find Bradbury everywhere. And all these years later, I can still vividly remember details of some of the stories from October Country. And that's a long time ago. I don't know if you ever read The Winds, which is where a former traveler, I think a travel writer, suspects that the wind has come to kill him because he's traveled the world and he's exposed the winds for what they really are, a murderous force in the world. And they've come for him. He's on the phone with his friend. He's talking to his friend, and the wind keeps getting louder and louder. And then, of course, he's gone. The Scythe creeped me out because it's about a guy who finds himself in possession of a scythe and working in a wheat field. But the scythe is the reaper's scythe, and the wheat field is humanity. And he is confronted with a stalk of wheat he does not want to cut. And then he goes a little berserk and etc. The Jar. You might have seen this on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. The Jar is creepy as hell. I won't spoil it for you, but Ray Bradbury wrote some pretty horrific, creepy stuff. And as a kid, I soaked it up. The Man Upstairs is the one I remembered when I was figuring out what to do for this podcast, which is about a vampire who comes to live in a boarding house, I think in Greentown, Illinois, which is his hometown. The grandson of the woman who owns the house figures out what this creature is and what he would have to do to kill it. And all I can say is the way grandma prepares either a chicken or a turkey has a lot to do with how this young man kills the vampire.
Oh, my goodness.
I also gobbled up everything I could by an author named Edward Eager. We had that at our local library. It was the first time I was introduced to the idea of books having sequels. Characters and events from one book would show up in another one. This is awesome. Whoever thought this up is amazing. Now, these were fantasy novels, but grounded in the real world, sort of like magic realism for beginners. And I remember there was one called Half Magic. That was my favorite. I probably read that a dozen times. It's about a magic talisman which grants you half of what you ask for. It's an object, a magic object that's fading in power. So if you want $1 million, you wish for $2 million. And I've used Half Magic as a metaphor for American politics for the last 19 years, which is the Republican Party has wished for twice what it wants, knowing it'll always get half. And that's how they keep advancing their agenda. They keep asking for more and more ludicrous shit, knowing that we'll give them half of what you want in the name of cooperation and centrism. There was Knight's Castle, The Time Garden, 7 Day Magic, a bunch of others. Many years later, my sainted mother was at a book sale at the local library, and she bought the original copy of Half Magic that I had checked out as a kid, gave it to me as a birthday present when I was like 40 years old or something. So,
wow,
bless her heart. Now, at our elementary school, I discovered that you could check out vinyl records and listen to them during whatever library time. And me and like 2 friends of mine discovered that Edgar Allan Poe was available, being read by Basil Rathbone.
Oh, my goodness.
So while everyone else is reading whatever the hell they're reading, we're in the corner listening to The Telltale Heart or The Cask of Amontillado or The Pit and the Pendulum being read by Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Which was awesome. I don't know about you, but we had something called Junior Scholastic when I was a kid. And that's where
I think we had that. It's hard for me to remember.
They hand out checklists of books you really want to buy, and they urge you to buy books. And it was a scam, but they bought books that way into the school. And my mom was a teacher, and the deal was if your class ordered X amount, they throw in like 5 or 6 more as a bonus. And, so I got the books I ordered plus a few bonuses. And I was a voracious reader, but I was an indiscriminate reader and an indiscriminate viewer. I just watched what I wanted to watch as a kid that I liked, like every other kid. So, did I watch The Time Tunnel and Land of the Giants? Yes, I did. And I enjoyed them. And the original Battlestar Galactica, which I believe Harlan Ellison used to call the Battlestar Ponderosa because Lauren Green was there overacting. Yes, I watched that. And Space 1999 and all the rest. And they were mostly garbage. But I would also, on, I believe, Family Classics with Fraser Thomas, which is a Chicago show, every Saturday or Sunday, you could watch the 1960 version of The Time Machine with Yvette Mimieux. Oh, yes, Yvette Mimieux. The 1959 version of Journey to the Center of the Earth with James Mason, which gave it so much class. It's just science fiction until James Mason shows up doing his James Mason accent. And then it becomes something that's, oh, okay, this is legit. There was the War of the Worlds, and of course the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and all of those still hold up really well. I thoroughly enjoy them, and I will watch them again whenever they're on. I also began reading what other people thought about those books and movies. So like reviews, critics, fellow fans who were saying, yeah, nitpicking stuff, but here's stuff you should check out if you like so-and-so. So I began to develop a more, sophisticated palette.
Mm-hmm.
And so I liked, but I did not love Star Wars. But on the other hand, I loved Alien. In space, no one can hear you scream. Loved that movie. My friends and I loved it. My friends and I also discovered writers like Spider Robinson. Spider Robinson is a hippie who wrote like a demon. He was a hell of a good writer. He was going to be the next Robert Heinlein, but his stories were all like very uplifting and hopeful, and the future looked possible. It gave us a thing to look forward to, and he was just awesome. I raided bookstores looking for new stuff. Then my friend Mike was off at college, and he told me, I didn't believe this, that they were teaching classes at the college he was at in science fiction. And I thought, what?
That's not possible.
What the hell are you talking about? This is garbage literature. Everybody hates it. It's nothing. So somewhere along the way, science fiction was becoming literature, Blue Gal. And, and that's when we all began to grow up just a little bit. And our grip on our childhood favorites began to loosen a little bit. But tell me your story.
Well, I was thinking about this and trying to remember what I read and when. But I do remember after I graduated from college joining the Book of the Month Club. And in 1986, the main selection for Book of the Month Club was a book called The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood.
Yeah.
And it looked really interesting to me, not only because it was written by a woman, which was my thing, but it had a religious element to it. And it seemed like kind of an alternate fiction about religion. And I read it cover to cover.
What were you doing at the time? What was your preoccupation at the time?
My preoccupation?
Yeah, you were a member of the church?
I was working in Boston, as a secretary or whatever for Mother Church and doing different. Yeah, I mean, I was fresh out of college at that point.
Religion was a big
going
part
to
of your
Harvard
life.
Divinity School.
Yeah. I was going to say it fit right into where you were at the time.
It fit right into where I was. Yeah, I was a graduate student in 1986. So, so it really hooked me on her books, and so I did read more of her books. And I kept reading her as she continued to publish, and she is still writing, and that is amazing.
Yeah.
That she's still writing. I always say to you when I'm joking around, and I don't mean to joke about suicide, but I do say, and pardon me if this is triggering to anybody, but I say I would never commit suicide as long as there might be another Margaret Atwood book coming out.
You hear that, Margaret?
I'd miss it.
It's on you, Margaret. It's on you. Yeah.
And I have also said to you that, that is now a part of not only the science fiction canon, but the feminist canon and the pro-women's rights canon, the abortion rights canon.
Well, prestige
and it's
television.
become a part of our culture through the television program.
Yep.
And, it was new. It was something new in 1986. So, if you're in love with The Handmaid's Tale, I really want everybody to go out and read Oryx and Crake, which is a later book that she wrote about what happens when megalomaniac scientists find a way to take over our society.
You mean tech bros, honey?
Bros, yes, tech bros
taking over society. Wow.
And it's amazing. One of the things that I love about Margaret Atwood, I connect her and her writing to my mother.
Oh.
My mother was a painter and printmaker and visual artist. And she always quoted this reviewer who reviewed a show she did of her work by calling it a giggle in the middle of a nightmare. And that was how my mother made paintings. They would be very dark or somewhat odd in some way, and then there would be a funny element. And that is Margaret Atwood's writing. You'll be reading along, and it's this dystopia, and people are suffering, and all of a sudden, there's a caterpillar. This is not spoiling Oryx and Crake. There is a caterpillar where, in order to prevent people from killing the caterpillar, genetic scientists have put a picture of the Gerber baby on the caterpillar.
The cat killing it. He's
and
too
made
cute.
It genetically develop so that this caterpillar walks around with a little white baby's face on it. And so you're never going to stomp on the little white baby's face. And then there's this Oryx and Crake, it just has so many funny moments where they have genetically modified chicken so that all it is two breasts walking around with no feet, and you pour the food in this hole. And it's a live chicken, but it has none of the organs that it needs to be alive. It's just the breast meat. And actual, that is actually, they're now making, invented genetic meat, which is not an animal, right?
No. You can print meat now, right?
That is predictive of what actually is starting to happen with, we're making fake meat that doesn't kill an animal. Well, so, there are just these moments that are hilarious in this book where you see these things, but then you realize, oh, there's this mad scientist is, a term of art, and you think about Frankenstein and you think about it.
It's as old as the genre.
The really. Mad scientist in Oryx and Crake is much more glamorous than that. He's Elon Musk, but better looking. But what he does and how, and the way the story is told, and anyway, the audiobook is narrated by Campbell Scott. If you know who that actor is, he does a very good job. I do recommend the audiobook. It's good. You can also read the book yourself if you like it. But I try to get people turned on. That is my favorite, apart from Handmaid's Tale and The Testaments, which is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, which is also amazing. Middle Child read that as well as I did, and both of us were just stunned that an author could take the world of a book that everybody knows and loves and everybody's aware of and everybody has a sense of what The Handmaid's Tale is about. And then Margaret Atwood wrote The Testaments, and you think, this cannot be anything but rehashed Handmaid's Tale. But it isn't. It's a completely new telling of a different character story, deep, keeps you going, carries you through. I'm passionate about her, obviously. But Oryx and Crake, in between all of that, Oryx and Crake is one that I really love. I also like the Robber Bride. If you like stories about women that are set in the 50s, so to speak, that have a lot of relationship drama in them between women and best friends and so forth, Robber Bride is another one that's really, really good. And Blind Assassin is another one. Oh my God. Anyway, I could go on and on and on. But I want everybody who's listening to this podcast to go and experience Oryx and Crake, because it's
you have
a really, really good book.
That's the audiobook for our next car trip.
That's the audiobook for our next car trip is Oryx and Crake, narrated by Campbell Scott. Absolutely.
Can you tell that we do a lot of reading in this house? Can you tell that there aren't enough hours in the day between podcasting and podcasting and podcasting and podcasting and our day work and so forth, that we do try to cram in.
Getting taxes done.
Oh God, yeah. And, cleaning up the war crime that is our basement a bit at a time, that we just really fell in love with reading young. And there's a very specific genre called science fiction where we discovered people gather in conclave with each other to talk about this stuff. And they're called science fiction conventions. Very exciting. Science fiction conventions. I still have some stuff from WindyCon from the mid-90s where I won an award. And my story is reprinted in the literature from the convention. That is, I'm sure the rest of all evidence of that have crumbled to dust, but I still have a copy of it. Chi-Con, Chicago Convention was awesome. I went there a few times. Milwaukee Con. I went there with my late friend John, and that's where we met Harlan Ellison and David Gerald, who at the time was a giant asshole. I hope he, but we discovered that his intensity and his teaching method, because we did sign up for one of his courses, one of his panels, was because he just got out of an EST thing.
Oh, Lord.
Or a LifeSpring thing. And he was like, do you care about this or not? Say it. And he was very, very intense. And I hope he got over that. And via telephone, we had Harlan Ellison call up Isaac Asimov. So I got to listen to those two guys talk on the phone on the speaker system. Now, I was in my 20s working at CNA Insurance in the Loop when I found out from the guys running the popcorn store across the way that Robert Heinlein had died. So no more Heinlein. And the reason that I trusted their word and I kind of knew it is that they were always packing a paperback. Every time I walked in, they were behind the counter. If nobody was there, reading a paperback of science fiction, something or other. And so there was this culture of people who read science fiction on the L or the subway or at lunch, etc. And we all sort of nodded to each other, like, what's you reading? Is it good? Is it any good? And these are the guys who broke it to me that there'd be no more Heinlein stories because Robert Heinlein had passed away, which made us all very, very sad. My usual lunches in those days consisted of running to the Subway sandwich place down the block from CNA Insurance and reading a paperback while I ate. That was my social life during my lunch hour, which shouldn't surprise you, was not terribly different from when I was a stock boy at Sears in high school. And I was working my way through the Dune series in paperback, and I would hang out in the back aisle, or there were sofas that were kept on shelves like 2 stories high. I'd climb up there and read a chapter of Dune while I was working. So I was the same person, except at CNA I wore a tie, so that's a little bit different. And they paid me a little bit more, and I worked at a desk, and I couldn't smoke pot, in the back room. But the sacrifices
all of that,
we make.
Drift Glass, all of that was before science fiction became respectable.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there was 2001: A Space Odyssey and Blade Runner and Star Trek and Planet of the Apes and Twilight Zone. But the prevailing opinion among the literati was that, damn it, this is not literature.
Nope, not literature at all.
And it was a class thing, because literature with a capital L were novels like The Invisible Man, The Catcher in the Rye, The Old Man and the Sea, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Lord of the Flies. Oddly enough, literature with a capital L also included science fiction like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, and Slaughterhouse-Five. But as a genre, it was still thought of as a low-class pulp ghetto where second-rate hacks cranked out stories about bug-eyed monsters for half a penny a word. And I think science fiction movies had that kind of reputation until Star Wars, which we're going to get into as not science fiction.
Right. And there were a few that stood out, like The Day the Earth Stood Still or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but those were all one-offs. It was not like a continuous source of good stuff. It was like, oh, okay, I guess that's good, but the genre itself was always considered, garbagey and nothing you'd ever want your friends associated with. You didn't talk about it in public very much, or you were looked at funny.
So falling in love with science fiction was a forbidden kind of love, something that we were expected to grow out of eventually. You won't love Spock so much when you're in your 30s.
No, Star Trek
Yes,
is cute.
I will.
He's cute and all that, but what's with the
That's
ears?
something a 7th grade girl does, But no, we never did fall out of love with science fiction. We had our own vocabulary, our own newsletters, our own gatherings of the faithful. And in many cases, our heroes were accessible. You could go to a convention. The Star Trek convention I went to, Gene Roddenberry was talking about the new Star Trek movie.
Which was terrible, by the way.
Which was the first one was pretty bad.
Yeah.
But we all went to it.
Yes, we did. We sure did.
And then Wrath of Khan, redeemed the whole process of actually enjoying a Star Trek movie. And they came to the conventions. Walter Koenig came to a convention. Gene Roddenberry was at a convention. You could talk to them live and in person. They could talk to you as a live audience. Very exciting.
Yeah, I think it was Milwaukee convention. That's where Harlan Ellison debuted 2 or 3 episodes of the new Twilight Zone. So we got to see the new episodes, which turned out to be hit and miss, but one of them was his, of course, and it was starring a very, very young Bruce Willis
Oh.
in an episode called Shatterday. So we were like, we're getting the inside shit here. We're getting the good stuff. Because, some of the best places in the world to be as a young man was in the the convention suite at 1 a.m, drinking beer, cheap beer usually, eating whatever nachos they had laid out or whatever, and debating the merits of the novel Make Room versus the movie version. And can you guess the name of the movie which was made from the novel Make Room?
When we were rehearsing this, it took me a couple minutes, but I got it, didn't I? It's Soylent Green.
Soylent Green, absolutely.
And I got to say, you loved me for knowing that.
I did. It's like, oh, she figured it out.
I figured it out. Yep. I remember when we were dating, Driftglass, and it was one of the first 1 or 2 times you came to my house.
Yes.
And there on my shelf was the compilation of time travel stories.
Yes. I mean, greatest time travel stories.
And greatest time travel stories. And you looked at me like, oh my God. My girlfriend.
My girlfriend.
You have to be my girlfriend now.
You're my girlfriend now. I claim you. I claim you.
It really was. The look on his face was, wow. I liked her before.
I don't have to hide my secret shame because it's not shameful in this house. In this house, it's a source of pride. Well, and you could also at the convention screen in the pre-dawn hours with you and 20 of your new bestest friends. You could see like a movie directed by Robert Altman, starring Paul Newman, that I guarantee most of our listeners have never ever heard of before. It's called, and this is the little joke we made at the top of the show, Quintet. This is the description of the movie. Quote, during a future ice age. Remember future ice ages, Blue Gal?
Future ice age.
Remember when the Earth was going to freeze? Yeah. Dying humanity occupies its remaining time by playing a board game called Quintet. For one small group, this obsession is not enough. They play the game with living pieces, and only the winner survives, unquote. That's with Paul effin' Newman. Directed by Robert
you made
Altman.
me watch that movie about 18 months ago.
I might have. I don't feel bad about it. It's the sort of thing I would do.
It was for the podcast, everybody.
That's right. For the love of this podcast. That's right.
So love of science fiction is also something we've tried to pass along to the next generation in this house. Who look at cyberpunk as classic science fiction.
Yeah. Oh, that's old-time science fiction.
That's old. Yeah, that's from the 80s. That's old. It's easier now that gaming has become so sophisticated and story-driven.
Yeah. True.
And that comic books have graduated to graphic novels and manga is as widespread as it is today. Netflix brings so much science fiction into our homes now. And people are just accepting of it as, it's another style of entertainment that is accepted as part of the streaming services.
Well, and just to say, I mean, we watched the first season of The Man on the High Castle, Philip K. Dick, which I never thought would be made into, which is great. It was terrific. We also, I gotta say, I turned up my nose at a $100 million offering of the Foundation trilogy because it didn't suit me. Because you know what? They ruined the story. Now, would I, as a 10-year-old, have turned up my nose at that? Of course not. It would have been awesome. But I have since grown a little more jaded and sophisticated, but it's also because I love the original story so much. I love what and they broke the story by telling it wrong, by violating the one rule in the story that you're not supposed to violate. So it isn't about size or how much money you spend on it, but it has become way more mainstream and acceptable to the point where, I don't know, a third of all the movies that make good money are science fiction or science fiction-y in some way. Yeah. Anyway, when we were on with Hal Sparks, you remember what we talked about? Yeah,
he mentioned Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah.
Which was one of his favorite movies. We're going to do a science fiction university with Hal either here or on his show. We'll have to figure that out. This Ghost in the Shell is the famous manga series from the early 90s that was made into a full-length animated film in 1995. The blurb for the movie describes it as, quote, an adult animated neo-noir cyberpunk thriller, unquote. Let's see how much we can smush together to get the widest audience possible for this movie.
So many words. Yeah.
Yeah, but that description is both 100% correct and very funny when you consider that, quote, adult animated neo-noir cyberpunk thriller, unquote, would have been completely unintelligible to the giants of the golden age of science fiction, which ran between around 1938 to 1946, when historian Adam Roberts describes fiction which, quote, valorizes a particular sort of writing, hard SF, linear narratives, heroes solving problems or countering threats in a space opera or technological adventure idiom, unquote. And that's absolutely accurate.
Yeah.
Like, you meet the hero, he's a hero, the danger arrives, he defeats the danger in space.
Right.
Right?
The classic example of this, I actually read the entire thing, was E. Doc Smith's Lensman series, which is a series of the heroic adventures of Kimball Kinnison, and his crew who battle progressively larger forms of evil across time, space, and galaxies. And it's fine. It's perfectly fine space opera, but that was sort of how things were. Very linear, like you said, heroes solving problems, and the good guys win in the end.
Right. Now, during that period and really up until the early 1960s, science fiction was considered pulp juvenilia.
Absolutely.
And the golden age of science fiction is 13, right?
It's 13. That's famous saying. That's absolutely right. Yep. Strictly for kids.
Strictly for kids and teenagers and primarily boys.
Yeah.
And the ethos that it's for kids, you don't have sex in it, no one is caught with their panties down,
no one swears. No one swears.
And no one swears. They're just hard-hitting white heroes. That was absolutely ruthlessly enforced by John Campbell, the publisher of Astounding Science Fiction, and his editor, Kay Tarrant. They saw their magazine as being for young people.
She
and
literally...
protecting their morality was part of the mission of Astounding Science Fiction.
Years later when she was interviewed, because a lot of mythology grew up around her, and there was apparently a contest to see who could sneak past references to sex or bodily functions past her. Somebody got away with it. But in later years, she said, I believe this is almost a direct quote, is, "I don't care who you fuck. This is a magazine for teenage boys or teenagers." And it was basically that. These are the stories that you would read, often in like boys' life. They were intended to be clean and have a good moral lesson, and the hero wins in the end, and the human beings are always the good guys. And that's how it went for a really long time.
Yep. So the idea of an adult animated neo-noir cyberpunk thriller would also mostly be unintelligible to the transition age authors who followed the golden age, and even the new wave writers who came into prominence during the 60s and 70s, because the term neo-noir didn't start being thrown around until the 70s. And then it was exclusively a cinematic term, like Chinatown, right? You talk about it in movie reviews that you had a neo-noir. And of course, noir is a film term anyway.
From the 40s. But the neo-noir was like Dutch angles and shadows and hard-boiled detective. But it was cinematic. It was not literature. It was not books.
And the term cyberpunk wasn't even coined until 1980, when Bruce Bethke wrote a story with that title, and didn't come into wider use until after William Gibson's widely popular 1984 novel Neuromancer.
Which we've talked about on this podcast.
We have talked about on the show, yes. Yep. And yet, however much style, vocabulary, and technology has changed, science fiction is still a genre people fall in love with. It's something we celebrate, we argue about it. Like, for example, very recently in the New York Times Magazine...
The oldest argument.
And what is so funny is it's my dad talking to my husband.
Right.
And saying, do you get the New York Times Magazine because there's an article about whether Star Wars is science fiction? What?
Yeah.
And so this past Sunday in the New York Times Magazine, January 25th, 2024, Judge John Hodgman, fellow podcaster, headline Judge John Hodgman's case for categorizing Star Wars as fantasy. The series has never been science fiction. Quote, Michelle writes, every time Star Wars is referenced in an article as science fiction, my husband rants about it.
Guilty.
And I gotta say,
Michelle,
I know exactly what you're talking about. Michelle's husband says it's fantasy. I've read him, this is Michelle writing, I've read him multiple definitions of science fiction, but he refuses to acknowledge that he's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got news for you, Michelle. He's
Buckle
not
up,
wrong.
Michelle. Yeah.
He's not wrong. Judge John Hodgman says he's not wrong. Driftglass and Bluegill say he's not wrong. But here's what Judge John Hodgman wrote, quote, I hate these labels, but I do like clicks. So I'll say it. Star Wars is not science fiction. Yes, it has spaceships and laser guns, but as this film screams from its first frame, it doesn't care about the future. Only our lost utopias in a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago. It's a long time ago. That is a hallmark of fantasy since Tolkien. That's why the Millennium Falcon can make the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs when a parsec is a unit of distance, not time. It doesn't need dilithium crystals. It sails through scientific plot holes on the far more potent gas of nostalgia, samurai movies, and serialized westerns. And if anyone disagrees with me, please give in to your anger. Your ranting about it online will only make me stronger.
Really?
Unquote.
Argue. Fight me. Go ahead.
Right. Fight me. And you and I were talking about this, that Han Solo is dressed like a Western star.
Yeah, he's
in the
only missing a hat.
50s.
He's
got a gunsling. He's a gunslinger.
He's a gunslinger. He's a gun for hire from out of town, or he's a pirate. But and you know, there's no secret to that. There's no secret to what the origins of Star Wars was when it comes to, you know, it's the hidden fortress. And there's no secret that it's swords and princesses and rogues and evil empires and doing battle and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love J.R. Tolkien. I had a box set of the original Lord of the Rings. I read it a couple of times when I was much, much younger. It was gifted to me. I watched all the movies. Fantasy is a fine genre, and there is overlap between the two. They do come into contact with each other, and you can love them both. There's nothing wrong with that. But science fiction is science fiction, and it has mushy borders, but it does have borders. And we here at Science Fiction University patrol those borders constantly, making sure no one crosses over or has an opinion that we don't agree with. But that's the fun of it. That's what because the stakes are very low and the passion is very high.
Yeah.
And this is why we love good old science fiction. We love new science fiction. But this podcast, this episode has been about falling in love with science fiction. How did we fall in love with science fiction? And mostly it had to do with finding someone who spoke to us through accident or design or the Book of the Month Club or a favorite teacher handing us a book and saying, read this, you'll enjoy it. Read this, you'll really like this. And branching out from there. And then your friends are onto something and you hook up with them and you go, oh, yeah. Yeah. Do you know the library checks out records? And you can check out a record player and we can listen to Edgar Allan Poe. Like our parents would never let us listen to Edgar Allan Poe. And then at some point on that journey, if you stay in love, you start to just develop taste. And you realize a lot of the stuff that you used to read was garbage. But that's okay. Because is it Poe's Law? 90% of everything is crap. It is. Right. It just is.
Right.
But it's fun. And it was written, it was, half a penny a word pulp garbage. That's okay. I still have moldering magazines around this house that I believe your dad gave us, full of junk. But it doesn't matter because there's a story in one of them by Damon Knight that's really good. And that's why you buy the thing. I would haunt the newsstands looking for the next issue of whatever. And when one of my favorite writers was in Playboy in like the 50-year retrospective or when Kurt Vonnegut was getting published like a real writer, that felt like me. It felt like they were finally acknowledging that what I had loved for so long was worth reading and worth paying for. It was worth valorizing. It didn't have to be space operas. And so honestly, we would love to hear from you what stories you fell in love with. How did you come to this place? What brought you in the door? This episode, we're not reviewing a particular episode or particular novel. It's just we both realized we came to this thing as really passionate, enthusiastic lovers of the thing. And how did that
Yeah.
happen? Because it didn't happen with Westerns. It didn't
Nope.
happen with romance novels. I like those things. I love detective novels, but I don't feel the same way about them as I do about really good science fiction. And that's a rare and beautiful thing. And libraries are full of the greatest things in the world because libraries are civilization. I believe Ray Bradbury said that. And so we'd love to hear from you about your stories of falling in love with science fiction.
And you can write to us either at proleftpodcast@gmail.com. You can leave a comment over at our YouTube page underneath this podcast because it will be up there.
Mhm.
And you can contact us all the other ways that you contact us because a lot of people write to us. But proleftpodcast@gmail.com is where you can reach both of us by email. And we would really love to hear your stories of what you love about science fiction and how you got interested in it. And we love it, and we love talking to you about it.
Reminder, Science Fiction University is a project of DGPG Productions. You can support the show by donating via PayPal or Patreon. Details at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com. And thank you for joining us today.
See you next time.
See you next time.